Hi there. Welcome back to the Garuda podcast. I hope all of you enjoyed the previous four episodes, and it has been quite a journey hosting a podcast. In the first episode, I got to have a conversation with Tejas Joshi, who is flying the most advanced passenger jet in the world, the A350. In the second episode of the Garuda podcast, I got a chance to interview a pilot who has been flying for more than 2 decades, Captain Gitanjali Kadria. In the third episode of the podcast, I got a chance to have a conversation with Captain Ivan Luciani, who is a legend in the Gulfstream pilot community. And in the fourth episode, I got a chance to have a conversation with a quantum engineer about one of the most advanced quantum technologies which will be used by air forces around the world. Today's episode is even more special. I got a chance to interview a pilot who has been featured on CNN, the Daily Mail, BBC, and whose pictures have been widely adored all across the world. Not just being an avid photographer, he is also a highly experienced pilot who has flown for more than 9,500 hours, of which 6,000 hours were on the Boeing 747-400. He has also briefly spent time as a pilot in the depths of Afghanistan. He has been an aerobatics pilot, and he has also been an author where he has published some of his most award-winning pictures. Lastly, he has also spotted numerous UAP'S, some of which have been explained and some of which have not been explained. My next guest here is Captain Christiaan van Heijst, who is currently a captain for the Boeing 747-400, and he is a cargo pilot. I hope you enjoyed the fifth episode of the Garuda podcast, and I hope you continue to support the Garuda podcast. Let's begin.
Yeah. So welcome, Captain Christiaan, to the Garuda podcast. I'm so happy you accepted my invitation. I've been reading a lot about you, I've seen a lot of your pictures, and I've seen you in some of the other podcasts as well, with like Ryan Graves and so forth. So I was quite interested in learning about some of the experiences you had and your time as a pilot. So my guest here is Captain Christiaan. So Captain Christiaan is a 747-400 cargo pilot, and he began flying at the age of 14, and he has participated in the Dutch Aerobatics Championship as well, for which he received first place at the age of 20. Then he began working as a pilot for an ACMI airline on the Fokker F-50 turboprop. And he had a lot of interesting experiences while working as a pilot for the Fokker F-50. He also flew this aircraft in African countries and in the depths of Afghanistan. And lastly, he was flying the Boeing 737 before he started flying the 747. And Captain Christiaan has flown for more than 9,500 hours, of which 6,000 hours are on the 747. And lastly, he also has a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering. And one interesting fact about Captain Christiaan is that he has spotted a lot of UAPs, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So yeah, thank you so much for giving me your precious time, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you in this next hour or so. So the first question I just like to ask all of the people who come on the show is like what made you consider a career in aviation? And like, could you just describe some of your some memories you might have had from flying school as well?
Well, first of all, thanks for the nice introduction, and it's
Yeah.
completely my pleasure to be a guest on your podcast. Yeah, it was a nice summary you gave of my flying career, and yeah, it fits perfectly with your first question. It has to start somewhere. For my first flying experience in general was when I was a 2-year-old boy, and I was flying with my parents from Amsterdam to Washington. I was sitting next to the window of I think it was a 747-200. And I was just, even at that young age, I was just completely taken away by the beautiful view that's out of my window and the whole experience of flying. And even the old classic 747, it was a huge airplane. And I was just so impressed with the whole experience. Then later on, when I was 4 years old, I had another flight also on the 747 going to Phoenix. And basically that just reaffirmed my passion for seeing those views from above. So I think in retrospect that planted the seed that led to my interest in aviation and aerospace, and that's basically where the whole adventure started. So when I was in high school, I decided to become a pilot, and I adjusted my I don't know exactly the right words in English, but basically at the age of 13 or 14, you have to choose your subjects to follow. So I chose all the subjects that were necessary for flight school. And yeah, that's how it all started, basically.
Okay. Yeah, like the and I'll come back to this later, but like the 747 in general is like airplane, which like if, for a 4-year-old, the 747 is like the only airplane they think about. Like even when I was 7 or 8 years old, like that was the only airplane I used to imagine or think about whenever I used to go flying. And so so I talked about like you being a pilot on the Fokker F-50 and you were like flying in Afghanistan for some time. Could you, like, if you're comfortable sharing with us, like, talk about some of the flights in Afghanistan? Like, what did that comprise of? And
Yeah, sure. Well, it's important to notice that I wasn't a military pilot back then. I was flying for this civilian company, and we had military contracts. So that means that basically I don't have any security clearances. And it also means that I can openly talk basically about anything. So you can ask me anything from that period.
yeah, yeah,
As I said, I was flying for this Dutch company. They were basically leasing out the airplanes, including the crew, including to military operators like in Afghanistan. And we were hired by the Norwegian army to fly based in Kabul all around the country. And it was really interesting because basically we were flying VFR. That means that we were basically flying under visual flight rules. We just had to find our own way, basically. That gave us complete freedom. And those adventures were just amazing. So every day we had to fly all the stuff that came into Kabul to places like Mazar-e-Sharif in the north and Maimana and Bagram. And every time we had to cross the Hindu Kush Mountains, and especially with a relatively small airplane like a Fokker 50, it was quite an adventure because the Fokker 50, it cannot really fly that high. It's not really that powerful. So we were constantly flying in between the mountains. We were flying to gravel strips. We were flying to all kinds of places that you can barely call an airport. So especially in the first, let's say, 2,000 hours of flying experience, this was really as if I was being thrown in the deep end of the pool, but it was really, really a big adventure. So for most of the time when we stayed there, we were flying for 4 weeks in a row. And out of Kabul, we basically flew everything. We flew personnel, we flew cargo, we flew all sorts of generals and VIPs around the country. And it was really interesting. So sometimes we flew to one of those small airports like Mazar-e-Sharif in the north. And it was just a day like any other. And sometimes, I mean, it was an active war zone. It was back in 2006. So sometimes there were rocket attacks or mortar attacks. And then let's say you were about to land, and then the tower controller at these airports tells you to go around and fly back to Kabul because there's an attack going on in the airport. And it sounds really adventurous, but from the cockpit you don't really see any explosions or stuff. So it's a surreal experience. That's just one of the examples. And one time there was a general who came into Kabul and he wanted to basically see where his troops were stationed, and he wanted to get an overview of the country. So basically we took him for a sightseeing flight over Afghanistan. And since we had complete freedom of flight, we could basically choose wherever we wanted to go. So he said, I want to see this valley, I want to see this place. So we just took off and we went there, or we went there. And it was a really, really nice experience for me as a pilot. Then again, especially in retrospect, we were quite vulnerable there. Especially, when you're parked at the airports, an airplane is a really easy target. And a couple of times it happened that, especially in Kabul, that militants, they were trying to aim mortars or RPGs at our airplane, especially when it was parked. So sometimes we had to go to the shelters and wait for the attack to be finished. But it felt really surreal, basically. But all in all, it was a great experience for me as a beginning pilot.
so, so like just like as a follow-up question, like I had, I think you know as well, like Captain Ivan Luciani on the show a few weeks ago, and at the beginning of his career, like he was an air ambulance pilot, but like his schedule was very unpredictable. Like sometimes he flew during the night, just like on a 2 hour notice, sometimes during the day. But like, you know, he flew into like the depths of Asia as well. So like when you were working in Afghanistan, was this like a similar case where you had like a very unpredictable schedule and like you just talked about the terrain as well, but was your schedule unpredictable in that sense or?
Yeah, definitely. Well, we didn't even really have a schedule because we were just one crew there and one mechanic. So I think it was twice a week. There was a 737 coming into Kabul, transporting all the officers and cargo into Kabul, and it was basically up to us, the flight crew, to make sure that all the cargo and people were being flown to their destination within Afghanistan. So often at night we were sitting in a restaurant or at the bar, and then one of the I think it was called a MoveCon, one of these officers that control all the logistics. He came to us and he said, you know what, tomorrow you have to fly so many passengers and so many people, and it was up to us to basically come up with a solution. Sometimes we had to fly, let's say, 90 people around, and the Fokker 50 can only hold 50 people. Especially if we have to carry some cargo, we could maybe only carry 20 people. So we just made up our own schedules, and we had to make sure that all the people were at their right place, let's say by the next Friday. So we had complete freedom, and sometimes it happened that the weather was so bad that we couldn't fly, and sometimes the weather was nice, so we did 2 flights, 6 flights. It was really up to us.
Okay, yeah, sure. And so, and like, so you're also an author, and like you have written quite a few books, and I got to see some of them as well. And like about, like you basically put all of the pictures that you've kind of captured over the years. So, so like I said before, like when I had Captain Ivan Luciani, we were talking about his books as well, and like the main focus of his books is like sort of on corporate aviation and like inspiring young people. What is like the main focus of your books? Is it also to like inspire people and encourage them to go become pilots, or?
Basically, the books I've published so far, it's closely connected to my photography, and my photography comes from a deep need to share the beauty of flight and share the beauty of literally the higher perspective that we have from above. So I'm not really trying to inspire people, but I just want to share the beauty that I see, and combining that with the experiences that I have as a pilot. So I write short captions and short stories with my photos, and that proved to be a really good way to show the general public what flying is like. And especially, you know, the things we see from the cockpit, it's mostly reserved for just pilots. So if I can share those views and those amazing experiences with people who don't have the chance to sit in the cockpit, that's basically my goal, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, like your I've seen your Instagram page and like you have captured like dozens and dozens of pictures, and yeah, all of them are very, very captivating. And so so I said, like I briefly mentioned before, like you've flown a lot of different aircraft. Like you've flown the Fokker F-50, the 737, a glider, and now you're on like the 747, the mighty jumbo. Like what has kind of been like the differences between all of these aircraft? Like, and how has the transition been from so it kind of seems like each aircraft you flew subsequently grew bigger and bigger. So how was that transition? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I started with glider flying, but that was basically because it was the only type of flying that was available for me at a young age. But I think it's important to mention that every airplane is specialized in its own field. So let's say the Fokker 50 was really specialized in heavy duty work. Let's say in Africa and Afghanistan, short range. It was a workhorse in that sense. The 737 was a really good airplane for medium range, flying passengers, etc. And the 747, especially nowadays, is just a really good airplane for carrying cargo over large distances. So it's very difficult to say which airplane is better or nicer because every airplane has its own characteristics. But for me, it's the biggest transition was actually going from the turboprop, from the Fokker 50 to the 737, because flying jet engines and managing the flight at higher speeds, like with a jet airplane, is completely different compared to flying turboprops. This has to do with basically the flight characteristics. So when I went from a really small airplane, let's say Cessnas, to a turboprop, it was basically the same principles, and the speeds were not too high. But the moment I started flying the 737, it's a completely different ballgame. The airplane is really sleek, so it's difficult to lose energy and speed during descent. So let's say with a turboprop, if I made a descent, and if I would, let's say, make a mistake in the calculations with my descent, I could just close the power levers or the thrust levers, and the airplane would just decelerate and descend, and you can always make the runway. But with a 737, especially with a 747, there's no way to just lose energy. So you really have to plan your descent and basically plan your way to losing altitude, speed, and energy. And that was the biggest transition for me.
Okay. Yeah, like I have briefly flown just on the 172, and even like yeah, like you have, because it's like in my opinion, it's mostly like a plane for like student pilots, so like you can make mistakes. But yeah, with the with the big jet, that's not possible for sure.
Yeah, well, I must say,
So
of course,
yeah,
with the big jet, you can
yeah,
still make mistakes. I mean, sometimes it happens
yeah,
that you plan a perfect descent, and then
yeah,
ATC, air traffic control, they give you a shortcut, and all of a sudden the whole descent is just completely messed up because you were planning for something else. But there's still ways to work around. I mean, we can use a speed brake. In worst case, we can lower the gear and using it as a speed brake. So there's still ways to let's say fix mistakes, but the margins for managing your energy are just much smaller. So that's why when people learn to fly, they will learn to fly at a smaller airplane where there's much more margin, more stable airplanes. So for many people who think they can just start flying a 747 without experience, that's very hard. But like you say, you
yeah,
have to learn somewhere, and yeah, well, gaining experience is just the most important thing.
yeah, most for sure, for sure. So like and like just we were just like briefly talking about like the all the planes you've flown. Like, do you remember what it was like in your first solo? Like, that's kind of like the defining moment where you're like completely independent, completely in charge of the airplane. How was it being alone in the airplane?
Yeah, definitely. But by the way, did you fly solo already, or are you looking up to it?
No, no, I'm looking up to it, but I've not flown it yet. But like, I know a few people who are like undergoing training right now, and they've just soloed, and it has been a beautiful experience for them. So
Fantastic. Yeah, I guess it's one of the most important flights that any pilot can have. And I still remember my first solo flight vividly. It's still one of the most important flights also in my life, in my career. I was flying a single engine piston. It was not a Cessna, actually. It was a Grumman Tiger. It's a low wing airplane. It was a really nice airplane, and I think it was December. It was relatively cold with clear skies, and I did my circuit training, so I was practicing the landings. And all of a sudden, my instructor said, "You know what? Just stop the engine." And he got out. He gave me a tap on the shoulder. He said, "Now you go and do it yourself." And I did see it coming at one point because I was already flying for maybe 10 hours or so, which is normally the mark where people go solo. But really, it was like a shock to me because all of a sudden I realized that I was going to be in charge of the airplane myself. So of course I just did all the drills, all the checklists. I started the engine again, and I was taxiing out to the runway. And I suddenly heard all sorts of noises and sounds that I was wondering if I ever heard them before, because you're just so attuned to what's going on and afraid to miss something, etc. But basically, I took off. I made my circuit. I did 2 landings, I think maybe 3 landings, and I came back, and the whole experience was just surreal. I was really excited. I won't say nervous, but it was really exciting because you're in the air, and there's nobody to help you out if you make a mistake, or to let's say correct an input if you do something wrong with the landing. But the whole experience was just amazing. And I must say, during the flight itself, I was just hyper focused on doing all the procedures and flying at the right altitude and speed and managing the landing, which went fine. And it was mostly in retrospect that I realized that it was monumental, that I was working toward this moment for such a long time. And then you're really trusted with an airplane, because literally, I was giving the confidence by my instructor to handle the airplane all by myself. And this happened actually even before I had my driver's license. So for me, it was like the most magical moment in my career. And also the solo flights afterwards, because you had to do some solo navigation flights, etc. And every time I realized that I was in charge of my own airplane, I was in charge of my own life, and I was flying literally with capital. I was flying, and this was just this is amazing experience. Every pilot will always remember his first solo. Right, that's an interesting question, because I don't think there's a simple answer. But in the last, let's say, 13 years that I flew the 747, I flew to very interesting airports. For example, it's very interesting to fly, or challenging to fly, to airports like Quito, Latacunga, or Mexico City, that are high in the mountains, high elevation above sea level. So basically what happens if you fly into those airports is that the air is so thin that the true airspeed of the airplane becomes very high. And especially with the 747, which is already a heavy airplane and it flies at high speeds, the turn radius becomes really, really large. So you have to plan your turns, you have to plan your descent, and especially airports like Bogota or Kabul or Quito, where you're flying in between the mountains, you really have to plan your descent and all the turns, etc. So that's very interesting. Also very challenging is, for example, some African airports like Lagos in Nigeria. And if the weather is nice, if it's not too busy, that's it's just a nice airport to fly to. But the moment that there are a lot of thunderstorms around, or let's say the radar of air traffic control is not working anymore, all of a sudden the stress level goes up, and it can become very, very interesting very fast. So you have to stay on top of things. Other interesting things that will always be with me is, for example, the flights into heavy weather. Sometimes when you're crossing the ocean, you don't have a chance but to go through some thunderstorms here and there. We try to limit the time in those clouds, of course, but that's always very interesting. And yeah, the challenging thing with flying cargo is that we fly with very different weights. So sometimes we carry the maximum payload, the airplane is fully loaded, and then the airplane is flying completely different compared to empty weights. And that's quite challenging as well. So it's not specific for a flight, but it's just very challenging to see how the airplane is handling differently every time if you have a different payload. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, sure, sure. And so one thing like you have kind of done before is like the UAPs you have been spotting, and so like about UAPs in general, like a lot of experts have been highlighting the presence of UAPs lately. And like a lot of people who I talk to about like UAPs or UFOs in general, they don't really acknowledge the existence of them because they're like, why don't we see them? Like, why doesn't the average person get to see like UAP phenomena? So, like in general, in your experience, like, how has the experience been like spotting UFOs, and like, are there any like specific locations or countries, or like even at least in the high in the sky where you have to be to see them, or is it just like pure luck or based on chance?
I think it's important to note that I've only seen a handful of well, let's say UAPs. I'm not even sure what they are. It was only happening in the first couple of years of my career. I've only seen 4 things that I cannot explain. And I have no clue what they are. And I completely agree that skeptical people are right. I mean, if they're everywhere, why don't we see them? I think it's important to stress out that even for pilots, even credible observers like military pilots, civilian pilots, it's still a pretty rare phenomenon to see anything. And in the last, well, actually the last time I saw something strange was over 13 years ago. So it's not that I'm seeing stuff every time. But basically, I'm not even sure if it's UAP. It's just, you know, my search for answers started when I saw the interview with Commander David Fravor. I think it was on the Joe Rogan podcast. And he was talking about his experiences as an F-18 pilot. And it was only then that I realized, I think it was in 2020, it was only then that I realized that he was talking about some of the stuff that I've seen in the beginning of my career and that I never had an explanation for. And basically, that's when I started to dive deeper into the topic, because for a long time I always thought that the stuff that I've seen, even though it was strange, was probably something military. We never know what kind of military hardware is flying around. And the moment I heard military pilots talking about these same experiences, then I realized that there might be something more to it. To give you an example, twice I've seen a really bright light falling vertically down. Once was at night, once during the day, and I have absolutely no explanation what that could be. Weather phenomena are very interesting. Sometimes you see some strange lightning strikes, but in this case there was no thunderstorm around. It was just completely clear skies. So basically I rule out any weather phenomena, especially since I haven't seen anything since in the last 14 years. And these military pilots, they started talking about these objects as well. Once I've seen a really strange light high in the sky. It was moving erratically before shooting off at an incredible speed. And once I've seen a really solid dark object really far ahead of us. Honestly, I don't really, personally, I don't like the term UFO because that implies that it's an object, that it's something flying. Personally, I like the term UAP more because it describes a phenomena. And I think that fits better with the things I've seen, because honestly, I don't know what it is. But my search for answers also comes from the fact that I'm worried about flight safety. When you're flying an airplane, of course, especially in nice weather, we have a really, really good visibility and good view. And as a pilot, we're constantly scanning outside for things that could be a threat to us. For example, at night, when I see a light that I don't expect or any flashing light, I immediately want to identify, because it could be another airplane. It could be something that could be a threat to our airplane or flight. So when I see something flickering or if I see something moving, I'm immediately drawn to it because I want to know basically what it is. So the things that I've seen, I was immediately attracted to it because you see something moving and maybe something's from the corner of your eye or something straight inside, and you just want to know what it is. And most of the time, it's easy to identify. I mean, even last night or 2 nights ago, I saw a Starlink passing by, and of course, I immediately saw it. And I mean, it's a beautiful sight, but immediately. And my eyes were drawn to it, but I recognized it because it's quite common. The moon was rising at one point, so we were flying at night over the Atlantic, and all of a sudden you see this bright spot appearing on the horizon, and then you see the moon appearing. So those are all quite mundane things, and other traffic around. Sometimes you see some lights from other airplanes, etc. It's all pretty common. But every now and then we see something that we cannot identify, and that's the reason why I started diving into the topic, because more and more pilots are coming forward with their sightings, and I think there might be a genuine flight safety aspect to it, and that's my biggest take, because we even saw with these Chinese spy balloons that were shot down over the United States 2 months ago. For the first time, it was basically acknowledged that there was really something in the airspace. And for a long time, pilots have been seeing things in the sky, small things, lights or big things. And now we actually have proof that there is something sometimes floating in the sky. So I think this illustrates that when pilots see something, it has to be taken serious, because it could be something like a spy balloon. It could be maybe even a new weather phenomena. I honestly don't care. But I think it's important that we have to keep the topic open without all the stigma around it.
Yeah, for sure. Like on all, like there's so many podcasts, like even the Lex Friedman podcast, where with I think it was with Andrew Bustamante, they were also talking about UFOs, and like some people are trying to demystify it, but like I haven't seen one yet, but like I'm curious to know, hoping to see something someday. And so yeah,
Oh, by the way,
and like
sorry, I remember you asked also the question if they're maybe located in specific positions. I think it's also important to note that for a long time UFOs or UAP were the domain of the United States. It's like Hollywood fiction. But the 4 things that I've seen, they were all over Europe. Twice over Greece, once over Spain, and once over Germany. But many of my colleagues, they've seen things over the Atlantic Ocean, over Africa, over South America. So I find it difficult to say if there's a hotspot anywhere or if it's located somewhere specifically. I think it's honestly a global phenomenon. But since the American culture is dominating nowadays, that's the main focus of UAP. And also, of course, the U.S. Navy pilots came forward with the sightings. So it's basically the American pilots coming forward that gave the idea that it's an American phenomenon, but it's definitely worldwide.
Yeah, like at least in my experience, the skepticism starts to come in when, it's like, how come only people in the US see it, right? So like a lot of people, so I think that's where, the skeptics come in and say, okay, like why is it only in the US? But like based on what you're telling me, if it's like it's a very global thing, then for sure, it must be acknowledged. So um, and so so I'm presuming that you might have also flown the 747-800 if so like personally I know like there's virtually no difference in the cockpit, I think, but on the exterior there's like a lot of differences. Like you can see the engines, like the engines are different. It's much longer. Based on your experience, are there any significant performance-related differences between the two, or like are they almost the same? Or
well, basically, actually we call it the Dash 8. It's a 400 and the Dash 8 instead of 800. But that's one of the small things that I had to learn as well when I started flying there. But basically, the 747-8 is a completely different airplane compared to the 400. Like you said, it has a longer fuselage, and the wings are completely redesigned. New wings, new engines, and this gives the whole airplane a completely different flight characteristics. So the cockpit, they try to stay as close as possible to the 400 cockpit for commonality. So pilots who have experience on the 400, they could easily be trained to fly the Dash 8 without too much training and cost involved. But there were quite a few differences. For example, many systems are extra automated, where the 400, for example, is still flying with cables, so the pilot is literally flying the actuators on the flight controls. The Dash 8 is partially fly-by-wire, so it's partially computer generated, also to give the feeling of the 400. For example, when you're landing, the Dash 8 has a flare assist, and it's giving little automatic inputs to give the same sensation as a 400. Even though personally it felt still a bit artificial, I prefer the 400s. But performance-wise, the G and X engines on the Dash 8 are much more powerful. And but then again, the Dash 8, especially when it's fully loaded, is carrying much more cargo as well. So the fuel usage was about the same, but it's carrying more cargo. And it's a very interesting airplane to fly, and I'm very happy that I had some experience on it. About half of my experience on the 747 is on the Dash 8, and half of it is on the 400. So it was a nice mixture of flying both airplane types.
Yeah. But I believe so. Like the 400 can still fly at a higher altitude than the Dash 8, right?
That's right. The maximum certified altitude for the 400 is 45,000 feet, and the Dash 8 is 41,000 feet. I guess it has to do with the pressurization, but the 400 can fly a bit higher, but we rarely fly those altitudes. It's only when we fly empty or nearly empty that we fly at those altitudes, because it's more efficient, but it's quite rare.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. And so like I talked briefly about the fact that you were an aerobatics pilot early on in your career. So like which airplane were you flying as an aerobatics pilot, and like what are some of the maneuvers you performed as an aerobatics pilot?
Well, I was just performing in the so-called beginners class, so I wasn't really a professional. But just after I got my PPL, my private pilot license, I decided to do the so-called advanced flying course, which was really interesting. It basically teaches you how to recover an airplane after you went over its limits. So it's teaching you how to recover from a spin, a stall, but also you learn to fly the airplane, let's say flying upside down, and really the advanced stuff that you don't learn with a normal private license. And I just enjoyed it so much that I decided to invest more time in flying the aerobatics. So I was flying the Fuji I think it was the FA-200. It's a really sturdy airplane. It's a very nice airplane to fly. Single engine, piston, low wing. It was really nice, especially for the basic maneuvers. So what I did was barrel rolls, aileron rolls, loopings, all sorts of spins, hammerheads, and the challenging thing is to combine them in a sequence. So let's say if you do one of those championships, I think it was about a day or maybe an hour before the contest, you get the sequence. So it says after let's say you do the sequence, you start flying into the contest area. You have to start with a spin. After that, you have to do a looping, and then you have to do a roll, whatever. And the difficult thing is to manage your energy. So let's say if you come from a looping, if you don't have enough speed for the next maneuver, you cannot just make a barrel roll like that. You have to make sure that you leave the looping with enough speed to start your next maneuver. So making a simple, or let's say making a looping is one thing, but making sure that you constantly have enough energy for the next maneuver is the next challenging thing. And I had great fun doing it. And especially, I think it was in the last championship that I did. I reached first place, at least in the beginner's class, I must say. But it was really cool. But then again, it became so expensive because those flying hours are a bit more expensive than flying a Cessna. And at that moment, I decided to join my professional flying school. So I just had to focus my budget on flying commercially, instrument rating, multi-engine, etc. But if I have the chance somewhere in the future, I would love to pick it up again and maybe even fly a PITS or anything more high performance than that. So you never know.
Yeah, like I've seen like some of the Red Bull aerobatics planes, and like recently there was a Red Bull plane which landed on this helipad in Dubai, and that was crazy. Like I was literally shocked when they were able to pull off that maneuver. And in some of the air shows as well, like the Paris Air Show, and they're performing these crazy complex maneuvers. Like yeah, it's quite. I really admire the pilots, for being able to do that.
Yeah, it's amazing, yeah? And also the engineering behind it, the way that they constructed the airplanes to handle so many G-forces. That's just impressive.
Sure. And I think you like briefly talked about this before, but what are there any like differences in terms of like being a cargo pilot and like being an airline pilot? Like in terms of like planning, execution, or in terms of operational aspects, are there any differences?
Yeah, from a pilot's perspective, the biggest difference is, of course, that we don't have any flight attendants. So, of course, since we don't have any passengers on board, we don't have flight attendants. And the biggest factor is that flight attendants, they can be the eyes and ears of the flight crew. Let's say if there's a fire on board or smoke generated on board, people in the cabin, they will notice it first. But we don't have any people in the cabin. But of course, we do have a good smoke detection system. But sometimes it can be a big issue that we are the only eyes and ears in the airplane. So that's a big factor, especially since as cargo planes, we fly a lot of freight, including so-called dangerous goods. So that means we fly chemicals like paint, batteries, computer parts, you name it, we fly all that stuff around. And that comes sometimes with some extra measures. For example, if we have a fire on board, before the flight, we brief each other as flight crew on what we have to do if we have, let's say, a fire or smoke on board, and we know that we have lithium batteries on board or paint or chemicals, you name it. The drills are completely different compared to flying with passengers. And also, let's say, if we have a decompression, so if we lose cabin pressure and there's no more oxygen, with passenger airplanes, you immediately have to descend to altitudes where people can start breathing again, because the automated oxygen masks that drop out of the ceiling, they only last for 14 or 15 minutes for passenger airplanes. So you have to make sure that you're below 10,000 feet after 15 minutes. But with cargo airplanes, since we don't have passengers, we have, as flight crew, we have those quick donning masks. They completely cover our faces, and we can breathe for sometimes 2 or 3 hours on pure oxygen. So that allows us to fly some really interesting routes as well, especially over the Himalaya, that say if we have a decompression there, we don't have the necessity to start descending immediately. So since we can fly for 2 hours, even after a decompression at, let's say, 25,000 feet or something, we can still cross a huge area with high terrain. So operationally, that gives us some really interesting routes that some other non-cargo airplanes cannot fly. Before the flight, operationally wise, as I said, we have to brief each other on what to do in emergencies if we know that we have batteries or chemicals or even farm animals on board. I mean, we carry those as well. And during the flight, of course, we have to make sure that everything, before the flight, we have to make sure that everything is strapped in really tightly. So as a flight crew member, as a pilot, I do the walk around of the main deck, so I check every cargo, and I have to make sure that nothing is leaking. There's no strange smells that could indicate a leak as well, that all the straps are in place, that all the cargo is secured. And that's stuff that doesn't happen with passenger airplanes. In regard to flying the airplane itself and following procedures, we are just as professional as flying passengers. So we just it's mostly before the flight and briefing all the calamities that are really different from passenger flights. But for the rest, it's once we're in the air, it's pretty much the same as any other airplane.
Oh yeah, sure. So like how dependent are you on like technology? Like how much has technology changed your job as a pilot? So like when I've been chatting with a lot of pilots and they have said like the iPad has been like a true blessing for them in terms of like quickly gaining access to manuals and checklists. Like how has the introduction of newer technology affected your job?
Yeah, definitely. It's the iPad is a good example because before the introduction of the iPad, we always carried literally bookcases of manuals and paperwork with us. And nowadays we can find everything on the iPad. And even in the last couple of years, we see that there's a lot of updates on the iPad software, on the performance tools. So that's the app basically that we use to calculate the takeoff speeds and performance. All the Jeppesen charts, all the navigation charts, etc. It's all in the iPad, and it's getting more and more automated by the day. So on the positive side, I really like it. It's giving us a lot of flexibility. It makes it really easy to look up all the data, all the procedures, all the stuff that we have to know. On the negative side, if I look at how fast technology is evolving, I'm sometimes afraid that I might lose my job someday soon because
Yes.
technology might take over the job of a pilot. Then I'm not too afraid of it yet. I think it will take at least a couple of decades before technology is reliable enough to take it over. But it's a two-sided coin. So on one hand, it's really making life easier for us as pilots. Then again, yeah, it might be a threat to our jobs as well in the end.
Yeah. Yeah, like I know Cathay Pacific and Airbus are partnering to figure out how they could create like single piloted airplanes, but they have received a little bit of backlashing for that because a lot of pilots are not happy with that. And like also recently on social media has also played a big role in aviation, and there's like that story of that pilot who jumped out of his plane and he might plead guilty as well. So in my opinion, there have been a lot of downsides as well, but at the same time, there have been like a lot of positives of the introduction of technology. So
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Social media is in that sense, a different way of approaching maybe even life, but especially aviation. And through my social media, especially Instagram, I try to share the beauty of flight. I try to share the things that make me wonder and that make me think, and that and hopefully can inspire others in seeing the beauty of life. But like everything, it attracts some idiots as well. And like this I think it's Trevor something, the guy who
yeah,
jumped out of the airplane. When I saw that footage for the first time, oh my, it's ridiculous what some people do for likes or views, etc. And this guy, he is destroying a lot of freedom that we have as pilots, because I can imagine, because it was obviously clear from the first moment that it was just staged. And before you know it, there's new laws or legislation coming that's making flying more difficult or taking away freedom of pilots. And it's just unbelievable how some people can damage the goodwill that we have in aviation. And it's a double-edged sword. There are a lot of idiots out there, and there are a lot of people with good intentions as well. But then again, it's the same with everything in life. But it's yeah, social media is definitely changing how we see aviation, and hopefully I can contribute in a positive way.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And so like you were actually briefly talking about the fly-by-wire system when we were talking about the Dash 8. And like there are a lot of memes on social media and discussion posts on Quora as well about this fly-by-wire system. And in general, there has been like a debate that Airbus has a better fly-by-wire system than Boeing. I don't
Yeah.
think that's true anymore though with with the newer aircraft that are coming out. And like Airbus like tends to prohibit certain movements because of its fly-by-wire system. But like as per my understanding, it seems like Boeing gives like a lot more freedom in terms of maneuvering the aircraft. What are your thoughts on on like the fly-by-wire system, and is there any truth to this like debate on social media, especially on the fly-by-wire system?
Well, first a disclaimer, I never flew an Airbus, so
Yeah.
I have to be careful with my statements regarding Airbus systems because I genuinely don't have the experience with it. And I don't follow the discussions online about fly-by-wire, but I do know that among pilots, we have a lot of discussions, or let's say not even discussions, but it's nice to compare experiences, especially some of my colleagues who have both a lot of experience in Boeing and Airbus airplanes. So that having said, Boeing and Airbus have a completely different philosophy on how to approach flying and basically the design of their airplane. Boeing is more traditional and conservative in the sense that they basically continually developed the airplanes basically since the 1930s, where the pilot was always in control. The pilot was the brains of the airplane, and all the systems that were added to the airplane had to help the pilot to fly the airplane. And I think this is very logical from their point of view, especially where they came from. Airbus, however, came into the field much later. I think it was in the 70s or 80s, and it was a very logical thing to start introducing computers in the flight deck and having a pilot manage those computers. So they started from a completely different standing point. So the philosophy nowadays in how to manage the flight is also different. As I said, I don't have any experience flying the Airbus. Some pilots, they really like it because the workload is lower on an Airbus because the computer is doing a lot of stuff. Then again, some pilots, they don't like it because they have the feeling that they are not completely in control, and especially if something goes wrong. Let's say if there's some computer issues or systems are offline, then all of a sudden as a pilot, you're sometimes being, let's say, locked out of the system. It's not literally like that, but with a Boeing, you can always revert back to the lower level of automation, as they say. So worst case, and sometimes it happens, worst case, you can just disconnect the autopilot and you're literally flying the airplane again with cables and muscle power. It's different. Then, like you say, Airbus has a lot of systems and algorithms in place that prevent the pilot from doing stupid things. Let's say from stalling or flying too fast, the airplane will intervene. But it has some downsides as well. So I think that having said, both of the philosophies have their cons and pros. And we've seen that some accidents on a Boeing could have been prevented if they had more automation, but some accidents on the Airbus could have been prevented as well if the pilot was more in control. So it's a double-edged sword. It's a different philosophy. It's a different way of thinking. Yeah, but personally, but this is completely personal. I prefer Boeing because I like flying the airplane and I like the philosophy they have, and I'm completely at home and at ease with all the systems they have right now. So when I step in the airplane, I completely 100% know what the airplane is doing, and I will never have a moment where I'm thinking, what is it doing now? Famous last words. So yeah, that's my personal take on it. Then again, it could be that if I fly the Airbus one day, I like it as well. So I think sometimes the topic or the discussion is a bit simplified by some people. Also, to give you an example, when I was flying the Fokker 50, it already had some pre-Airbus technologies. After Fokker, the airplane manufacturer, went bankrupt, a lot of these engineers, they went to Airbus and they helped design the Airbus cockpit and philosophies. So what we had, for example, on the Fokker 50, when you had those power levers, they were still mechanical, but you put them in a, let's say, in a takeoff detent, which is like a fixed position, and the engines would just alternate the thrust a little bit, but you didn't see the power levers moving. Of course, later on, if you really wanted to add thrust or reduce it, you could physically move them. But this technology is also implemented on the Airbus. So at least what I've been told by some of my colleagues, the thrust levers are being put in a detent, and you don't see them physically moving anymore. So you can see, of course, on the instruments what the engines are doing, but you don't see it moving with the actual thrust levers anymore. The same with the side stick. You don't see the side stick moving according to what the autopilot is doing. So you can see it, of course, on the indications. Boeing is the opposite. So if the auto throttle we have on board, if it's adding thrust, I physically see the thrust levers moving forward. I can physically see what the airplane is doing, and the same with the control wheel we have. If the autopilot is turning to the left, I can actually see the control wheel going to the left. This is it seems very minor, but it gives us pilots a really good feeling of what the autopilot is doing, and this is missing. This let's say interface with the computer is missing on an Airbus, and I think this could play a major role here and there. But yeah, then again, on a simple point, I know that a lot of Airbus pilots, they love the space they have in the cockpit because they don't have this huge steering wheel in front of them. So that's also a reason why some of the pilots, they prefer Airbus.
Sure. And so now you're a captain on the 747-400. So, like, how have your responsibilities as a pilot changed, like, since you were a first officer? Like, has there been, like, because now you're kind of like the key decision maker. How has this kind of changed your responsibilities on board?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Very good question, because most of the people think that the moment you become a captain, decisions are easier because you can just veto anything. You can just do whatever you want. Well, it's a bit simplified. The biggest thing that people don't realize is that as a pilot, I'm not just responsible for the airplane, but I'm responsible for following the law as well. I'm responsible for following the procedures we have as a company. I'm responsible for flying the airplane within the limits that the manufacturer is stating. So Boeing, that's already a second manual. I'm responsible for the local law. I'm responsible for following the national law in the country where we're flying. So let's say if I'm flying a 747 to the United States, I have to make sure that I follow the FAA rules from the American government. I have to make sure that I legally follow the EASA European rules. I have to make sure that I'm following the procedures and limitations of Boeing. I have to make sure that I follow all the rules and procedures and limitations by the company. And all those things combined make the decision making very important. So if something happens as a first officer, as one of my instructors said when I was doing the command training, he said, as a first officer, your flying is 80% of your job, and managing the flight is 20% of the job, because you can just focus on flying, you can make decisions, and if the captain doesn't agree, he can change it. But you're just basically flying the airplane. But as a captain, it's 80% managing the flight and only 20% flying, because we have to not just manage the flight as in flight path and descent and landing, but we have to comply with all the rules and legislation. And that's the biggest difference, moving from first officer to captain. And that's also why it's very important that before you're being upgraded to a captain on a commercial jet, to have a lot of experience as a first officer, because as a first officer, you not just have to get used to the airplane and making decisions in flying the airplane. That's very important. That's the absolute basic fundament, basically, that you have to build as a pilot. But it's also very good to see especially in emergency situations or non-normal situations, how the captain is resolving it. And after, let's say, after 10 years of flying on the right-hand seat as a first officer, it's a matter of time before you start to see really interesting situations that are not described in any manual. I mean, we have a checklist, but many situations, they cannot be solved with a checklist. And that's where the human part comes in. And I've flown with many captains where I was really happy that I saw this let's say emergency situation or non-normal situation, and seeing how this specific individual, the captain next to me, was solving it. And that was really, really helpful. And I'm very happy that I was not, let's say, launched into the left seat early on in my career, because now I realize, especially afterwards, you realize that all those years of flying as a first officer, they really helped me to build my flying experience, my confidence, my ability to solve situations and to look through the procedures and see the bigger picture. And that's the biggest thing as a captain, because sometimes you have to make decisions that are not easy. Sometimes you have to choose between let's say choose between two options that are neither perfect, but you have to keep the safety of the flight in mind. So this is just something that has to come with experience and flying experience, building the flying experience, getting to know the airplane. It's absolutely fundamental before moving to the left seat, where you can just, let's say, to the first officer, you fly the airplane and I manage this or that. And so when I moved to the left seat, this was the biggest thing that I realized. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, for sure. No, I mean, yeah, like the thing about like following legislations, like I've seen certain videos on YouTube as well. Like every country has its own rules when you're flying through the airspace. So it must be quite challenging to make sure that you're following each and every single rule for sure.
Yeah, and
And
it's changing all the time as well, because just 2 weeks ago we got an update where the rules in both EASA and the FAA changed and the company rules changed. So every time before I'm going for a flight, I have to update my manual and I have to look at all the changes, etc. And that's something that's also part of the job. And for example, every so many months, Boeing is coming out with new recommendations or procedures. So you really have to keep on top of things, because you're responsible for every decision you make. So it's part of the job.
Yeah, for sure. And like, I was just kind of curious to know about your photography career, and like your pictures are spectacular, and your content has been featured on Instagram and in your books and a lot of news websites as well. So like I'm just kind of curious to know like what kind of cameras you use, and like when did your pictures first start getting so much attention?
Yeah, yeah, that's the
Yeah.
second career next to flying, and it's literally it started during my first training flights when I was just so amazed with all the views, and I had a really, really simple, stupid camera. It was even the beginning of the digital camera revolution, so it was a really, really useless camera if I look back on it now. But I was just so eager to capture everything that I saw, and this changed especially when I was flying the Fokker 50 in Africa and Afghanistan, because it was just so amazing, all the views, but also the adventures. And I realized I was so privileged to see those things and to be able to capture them, because I was just the only one in that position to actually see it, and this was so unique to live those adventures. So I started upgrading my camera equipment, starting taking pictures, and it was the days before Instagram, and I had a really simple website where I posted some stuff. And I got a lot of feedback, a lot of people commenting on it, and they really liked it. It was a very amateuristic site, but it was very popular. So the moment I realized that people appreciated it, I started upgrading my equipment further and further, and I was just basically challenging myself to capture the next best thing. For example, when you're flying at night, sometimes the northern lights are really beautiful, or the moonlight, and you need some really good camera and some proper skills to be able to capture that. So I was constantly challenging myself to capture those interesting things, and that's basically how it evolved into what it is right now. I've pretty much always used Nikon cameras, Nikon, and nowadays I have the Nikon Z7, which is mirrorless, and I like it. It's a really good camera. It's very practical because it's pretty light, and I can put it in my flight case, and it's also able to capture low light images with a very high sensitivity ISO. So I use a couple of lenses, all of them very strong lenses with a big aperture. So let's say a big lens opening for capturing all the light there is. And combined with that high-end camera, it's possible to capture basically everything we see from the cockpit, and that's just so amazing. As I said, when you see the northern lights, it's already amazing, but able to capture it and share it with the rest of the world, that's just fantastic. And it was only, let's say, maybe 6 or 7 years ago that my pictures were being picked up by some big media channels, and that was just overwhelming. Yeah, and the interesting thing is, like, it's like a snowball effect. I think it was the Daily Mail. It's a big UK based online newspaper. They placed an article about this Dutch pilot taking nice pictures with maybe 10 or 20 pictures. And then I got in my inbox within 24 hours, I got CNN, BBC, National Geographic, and it was like overwhelming. I never saw it coming. And I think it just needs, basically you just need one breakthrough, and then all of a sudden, once you're being picked up on the radar, it just starts growing and growing. And my Instagram started growing, and I really hope to expand my photography in the next couple of years to a much higher level.
Sure. And like, because you're flying at such a fast speed, does it become like a little bit harder to capture pictures, or is it is that a barrier towards capturing pictures, or?
Yeah, definitely. Well, of course, we're flying very fast, but we're flying very high as well. So if I just take pictures during day, there's not much of a difficulty there. Then again, I have to be fast because, if I see a beautiful scenery passing by, I cannot just make a 180 and take a picture of it again. I only have one chance. So I can only take pictures the moment I see something passing by. But the biggest challenge is actually flying at night, and especially when I take pictures with really long shutter times. And it's not so much the movement of the airplane, actually. It's much more the turbulence and the moving of the airplane that's sometimes challenging. And especially when I take pictures with, let's say, shutter times of 20 or 30 seconds, the airplane has to be absolutely stable, because otherwise all the stars or the moon, it's just completely blurry. So it's a challenge, but it's also something that I don't really control. So sometimes I have a night with just amazing views, and it's just impossible to take pictures because the turbulence or the shaking of the airplane. But sometimes when it's very stable, it's just a delight. And then I can start experimenting with different settings and different angles, etc. So it's always something new, and I never know what shows up before my window, of course.
Yeah, and sure. So, like, just as a follow-up question, like, I saw, like, in one of your pictures, you had taken a picture of a thunderstorm from a distance. And to me, like, it is obviously extremely dangerous, but it's like really fascinating how, like, airplanes can fly through bad weather or past bad weather, and like pilots are trying to manage the situation and maneuver the aircraft through it. On YouTube as well, I've seen videos of like even 747 pilots like trying to pass through a thunderstorm. Have you flown through any bad weather yourself, particularly, and like what kind of protocols or procedures do you follow as soon as you encounter bad weather?
Well, first of all, let me make clear that I only take pictures when it's safe. So when the workload is
Yeah,
low, when we're flying at altitude,
yeah,
etc., when I can just concentrate on taking 1 or 2 pictures. And so if the workload is high, especially in bad weather or during landing, I can never take pictures, of course. So that's
yeah,
important to
yeah,
note. But
yeah,
yeah, sometimes we always try to avoid flying into heavy weather because it can be dangerous. Even though airplanes they're very well designed, very strong, so they can handle it. But once in a while, it's just impossible to avoid it completely. We have some procedures in place. For example, the airplane manufacturer, in this case Boeing, they recommend the so-called turbulence penetration speed, and that's a speed that gives the best margin for upper and lower speeds. Especially when you fly into a thunderstorm with heavy weather, the speed can just fluctuate constantly. So Boeing recommends flying those speeds then. And basically, you have to avoid the worst parts. When we use the weather radar to scan for weather, we have a couple of different colors on the weather radar, which is between green, yellow, and red. And it basically shows the intensity of the weather ahead of us. So we try to plan around the orange or the yellow and the red parts, but sometimes it's just not possible to avoid it completely. And yeah, I've had some experiences flying through heavy weather. At one point, it was actually on the Fokker 50. I think it was in the area of Barcelona. We were approaching the area of Barcelona coming from the south, and there were just thunderstorms all over the place. It was really heavy weather, and we couldn't see them visually because we were flying in the clouds and they were embedded in the rest of the clouds. And we were navigating by the weather radar, and it showed us these red dots everywhere that we tried to avoid. And all of a sudden, we were just turning left and right, trying to avoid it, and we saw that the display on the weather radar was just constantly the same. And it only took us 5 minutes, and then we realized that the whole weather radar was just broken, or it was just frozen. I mean, the computer was just probably at an issue. So all of a sudden, we realized that we were flying blind. We were just probably going through a thunderstorm, and the next moment, I mean, there was hail coming on the windows, turbulence, lightning everywhere. So we were flying blind, and we were flying into the thunderstorm. Of course, the airplane could handle it, but it shows that we try to avoid the worst parts, but sometimes it's just impossible to avoid it completely. And one of those other instances was, for example, when I was flying from Europe to South America. We have to cross the equator, especially over the mid-Atlantic Ocean. There can be huge thunderstorms, and a single thunderstorm is not an issue, but especially in summer when they grow together, all these single thunderstorms
yeah.
growing together in a so-called squall line, it can sometimes be hundreds of miles wide, and then it's just a matter of picking the least worst part and just going through. So what we do then, it's not really official procedure, but we clean the galley, so we clean the kitchen to make sure that the coffee is locked down or empty, and no spaghetti on the on the ceiling afterwards. Then we just sit in the cockpit, strap in, and hope for the best. So, but the airplane is really sturdy. It's extremely rare if an airplane gets damaged or even worse in a storm. But then again, yeah, we have to avoid it just to make sure that we're on the safe side.
Okay, sure. And I just had one last question before we start talking about the 747. So, like about your pictures. So, like in some of the pictures, you have kind of been able to like capture the surreality of the situation, like kind of what you feel in the cockpit, like those kind of you're able to evoke those kinds of emotions. Over time, like does the airplane like become a part of you, where like you feel at peace and inside the cockpit, or
Well, yeah. Well, personally, I always feel at peace when I'm flying. I feel at home in the air, and
yeah,
yeah, especially if you're cruising level and the workload is low and the airplane is working fine, there's no weather, it just feels so peaceful. And especially if you fly at night and you have those beautiful views, it's just serene. It's just absolutely yeah, magical almost. And this is also what I try to capture with my camera and also convey it through words, because I think a picture doesn't really do justice. It has to encompass a fuller experience, but it's just beautiful. Yeah, nowadays, I have almost 6,000 hours on the 747, so the airplane doesn't have any secrets for me anymore, in the sense that I just feel at home. I know the systems, and yeah, it just feels like I'm home, when I'm flying. Let's say it
Yeah,
like that.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, like even just as a passenger, whenever you're sitting in the metal tube, there's like a special sense of like peace and tranquility like you experience. So
Yeah.
yeah. And so I had like just a few questions about the 747, and like just as you mentioned, like when you were 2 years old, like you're flying on the 747-200, and like every kid who I knew when I was young, like who wanted to be a pilot, wanted to fly the 747. And it has had like so many special uses, like Air Force One is a 747. NASA has its own variant. Uh, Force also the U.S. Air Force has had its own variant. It carried the space. It has also carried the space shuttle. So you've been flying it for a very long time. Uh, I'm not sure if there's like a short answer to this question, but like, what makes this plane so special? Like even compared to the A380, this aircraft seems to be like the one which has been like the most talked about. So, yeah,
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 the short answer is she's just beautiful. She's the queen of the skies.
yeah,
But that's
yeah,
that's 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 a personal opinion. But I think there are a couple of aspects that really work in favor of the 747. First of all, it's the timing when the airplane was designed and launched. It literally was a revolution in aerospace. Before that, we had the 707, which was allowing basically the ticket prices to drop and giving a lot of people the chance to fly for a reasonable price. And then with the 747, the range was becoming much longer. It allowed much bigger payload, both cargo and passengers, to fly, and it just changed the world of aviation. Actually, it changed the world because continents were all of a sudden connected by air, and where you had to take maybe 2 or 3 days to fly from, let's say, from Europe to Singapore, all of a sudden it became possible to do it within a day. And this revolutionized the way that we experience life, and maybe even our global culture. So I think the 747 made a huge, actually played a huge role in that change, and that added something to the charisma of the airplane. Besides that, I think it's also an extremely well designed airplane. It's extremely sturdy. It's from the days before the computer design, so the margins on construction were much higher, and this allowed the airplane to carry extreme loads, to be extremely redundant, very reliable. And this is something that the A380 never really achieved. First of all, I think it came too late. I think if they would have
yeah,
come up with the 380 20 years before, it would have made a big change. But the A380 just came in too late, and it doesn't have the how do you say this, the strength and the abilities of the 747. What I heard, I'm not 100% sure if it's correct, but they were planning to make a cargo version of the A380, but
yeah,
basically the fuselage was too weak, especially if it was standing in the blazing sun during summer days. The metal was getting too warm, and it didn't allow cargo to be transported completely fully loaded on both decks. And that basically made the A380 useless as a freighter. And the benefit with the 747 is that it's so sturdy, it can fly both as a passenger airplane and a cargo airplane, fully loaded all over the world. And this flexibility and this ability to carry so many kinds of payloads, etc., really makes the 747 a wonderful machine. And she rightfully earned her name in aviation history in that sense.
yeah, for sure. And so like the 747's fuselage is fairly long in terms of length, and even for the Dash 8. So like the sheer size of the airplane is mind-boggling, at least to me. Like what would you consider like what is like the most challenging aspect of flying or managing the 747?
By far, it's the only, let's say, Achilles heel of the 747 that you really have to make sure that during takeoff and landing, the wings are level. Because if you start to bank a little bit too far left and right, the outer engines or one of the engines might actually touch the ground. This sounds very easy, but in reality, if it's really gusting weather, if there's a lot of wind gust and unexpected turbulence, it can just happen that the airplane starts to bank because it's very sensitive to that. So this is something always to keep in mind when flying a 747, especially with its size and mass. Once it starts moving, it really requires some input to change that. Another aspect is, of course, because it's so large, it has a large mass as well. And especially, let's say, if you're flying an approach and there's a lot of turbulence and wind, once the airplane starts to move, you really have to be on top of it to make sure that it doesn't drift away left or right or too high and too low. So let's say if you compare it with a smaller airplane like a 737 or even a turboprop, you can really have fun flying it around like a sports car. But with a 747, it's literally a lady. You have to treat her really gently and make sure that she doesn't deviate too far from the path, because it's just a lot of mass that you have to control. Another thing to keep in mind, and that's basically all the stuff happening on the ground, because we have a huge turn radius. So let's say the distance or space you need to make a 180-degree turn, it's massive, and you have to keep that in mind, not to hit anything with your wings or with the tail. And some taxiways, they're just too small for the 747, especially with the Dash 8, because it's even larger. It's a whole new category together with the A380. When we were flying to airports like JFK, to Mexico City, and for example, Singapore, we had special taxi plates with us that showed us where we could taxi with the airplane and which taxiways were off limits because the airplane was too big. And this is really, yeah, of course, it's interesting, but it's really important as a pilot to keep in mind that you're really flying a massive airplane with a huge wingspan. So yeah, that's something that comes with flying large airplanes.
Okay. Yeah. And if again, like if you are comfortable talking about it, would you be comfortable sharing your opinion about the criticism like the 747 has faced? Especially during COVID, they finally decided to retire the 747, unfortunately, and like even the A380 has faced a lot of criticism for just like the 747 A380 are both like very, very large airplanes. They have a lot of maintenance costs, and some people have criticized it for poor fuel efficiency. Like as an insider, what's your take on that? Just like on the criticism it's faced.
Yeah, well, of course, the 747 is using a lot of fuel because we have 4 big engines using fuel, but it also depends on the payload. So let's say if you have an A380 or a 747, but even the 737, the fuel efficiency depends on how much you carry. So if you have a full payload, if you have a full load of passengers or a full load of cargo, the airplane is actually really efficient. It just becomes very fuel inefficient if you don't carry enough passengers. And that basically applies to any airplane. So especially with COVID, you saw the number of passengers drop everywhere. I mean, people were barely flying. And keeping a 747 in your fleet when maybe only 10% of the seats is filled, yeah, then it becomes a very expensive airplane to operate. And especially fuel-wise, it becomes a very expensive airplane. But as long as you just carry enough payload, it's a very good, reliable airplane. So that's why we also see that a lot of 747s are still flying as cargo planes, some old passenger airplanes even being converted to cargo planes, because the cargo market was still booming and the cargo planes were flying full all the time. And then actually, if you see that you have a full payload of cargo, the airplane is extremely efficient. It's just a matter of keeping the cargo holds full, and that's really a big challenge, especially nowadays when you see that a lot of passenger flights are picking up again, and many passenger airlines, especially the 777, they're carrying also freight in their lower bellies during normal passenger flights. So the competition is all of a sudden much higher, and you see the cargo yields dropping. So the price that's being asked for cargo is dropping. So it's becoming less and less efficient nowadays for operators to fly the 747. I must say the 747, I don't know. I don't know if maintenance costs are actually that high. It's probably higher than flying a 737, but many 747s, they're just so reliable. They just keep on going, and there's so many spare parts available. So let's say from all the 747s that have been retired, a lot of parts can be used again to keep the present ones flying. So honestly, I don't think the maintenance costs are really a big issue. Also, I think what's very important to keep in mind that, let's say, if an operator can decide to fly either a 777 or a 747. For many years, of course, the 777 was preferred because it only has two engines. It's using much less fuel. But then again, buying a used 747 was much cheaper, maybe 1/10 of the price of a new 777, and operators had to wait sometimes 2 or 3 years for the airplane to arrive. So that basically made the 747 quite a cheap airplane to operate. But as I said, it's only cheap to operate as long as you make sure that you have full loads of passengers. So nowadays, also because Boeing decided not to produce the 747 anymore, I think we're looking at the end of an era. Personally, I think it's a shame. I think the 400 especially still has a lot of life in it, and I think there should be a market for it to start producing it again. But environmental issues and pushing for less fuel usage is making it impossible to produce a 747 anymore. So it's the end of an era, and that's really a shame.
Yeah, like a lot of people, including myself, were a little bit disappointed when they said, okay, we're not going to be making this airplane anymore.
Yeah.
And I think it was like a similar kind of reaction even for the 380, because it's like it was just like no more 4-engine airplanes are going to be made anymore. So yeah, for aviators. And the final question I just have for you is so you've like culminated a lot of experiences as an aviator. So what kind of advice would you want to give to young aviators or people who might consider to go to flying school?
Yeah, well, follow your heart. That's the biggest advice I can give, and this applies to people who want to become a pilot, but also following your heart and intuition for anything that you want to do in life. And for me personally, I came from a family and a background that had no ties in aviation. Nobody was even interested in aviation in that sense. So I just followed my heart. I decided I wanted to become a pilot, even though a lot of people told me that I would never be able to do so, or I was stupid to do such a thing. I followed my heart, and it's not easy. I mean, it requires a lot of study. Financing can be an issue. I was lucky to get a financing for my flight school and to find a job. But eventually, if I look back at it now, it was really worth all the hard work. It was worth the long hours of studying, the nights of studying, all the risks I had to take, because as a young pilot, I had to take some risk with financing, finding my first job, and even leaving my first job just to get another job. So I had to take quite a few calculated risks. But I always did it listening to my intuition and following my heart. And now I'm captain on the 747. I was one of the youngest 747 captains at age 38, I think. And if I look at the red line through my entire career, it just literally following your heart. And of course, don't be foolish just jumping into the into the deep end without preparation. But follow your heart and see whatever comes on your path. And I think that's the biggest lesson that people can learn, not just in aviation, but following any dream.
Yeah, surely. So yeah, thank you so much, Captain Christiaan, for coming on the Garuda podcast. It's just this podcast is still in its infancy, so I was very happy you accepted my invitation and you chose to come on board and share your experiences. And yeah, I hope to stay in touch and see more of your pictures. So yeah.
Thank you so much. The pleasure was all mine.